Hello everybody, and thank you for joining us here for Maynooth University's panel for the Around the World Conference taking place this year, 2017. We've got a great panel for you this year. You've already seen Professor Chris Brunsdon of the NCG giving a fantastic presentation. Gathered here, we've got a great panel today, including Professor Susan Schreibman, Mr. John Chambers, Dr. Gavan Titley, Dr. Jane Souter, Ms. Andrea Martin, and Mr. Peter McGuire. Now please contribute to the conversation on Twitter and tweet to us using the hashtag ATW2017, and we'll try to get to your questions later on when we get to the roundtable discussion. Now, without further ado, I'd like to introduce our first speaker, Dr. Gavan Titley. Now, Gavan is a senior lecturer in media studies at Maynooth University, and he's going to be speaking about the far right and digital media.
Thank you. Good morning, Canada, and anyone else out there in the world. This is a great initiative. This is a great conference to be part of. My focus in this brief talk is going to be about the far right and its particular advantages within a sort of post-truth digital media environment we're discussing. And my focus on it is in a way because so much of the discussion about connective media, about social media and politics post-2010 has been about progressive movements and about the ways in which in the stunted and repressed revolutions in North Africa and the popular movements in Southern Europe, the role of connective media in mobilizing, in creating political collectivities has been studied. And in some ways, the ways in which the far right and reactionary movements have used the same kind of architecture and the same sort of systemic possibilities hasn't really been part of the discussion that much. But as the first speaker, I thought I should probably say something about the themes of the conference very briefly, and why I welcome the skeptical approach of the framing around these issues by the conference itself. One of the things which has happened, and particularly as the conference framework lays out, intensified post-Brexit, the European referendum in the UK on European Union membership, and also of course following the election of Donald Trump, so a debate which is very much driven by Anglophone media and the Anglophone world, is the idea of not just post-truth, but the role of filter bubbles in increasing partisanship, or fake news in making public participation and citizenship more difficult, and so forth. But one of the things that the approach to the conference rightly emphasizes is that when we use notions like post-truth, we have to say something about when pre-truth or the truth era actually existed. In other words, we often create some difficulties for ourselves analytically in terms of the kinds of labels that we use to explore and sometimes inadvertently reduce a lot of different issues into one discussion. I think this is absolutely the case when the concepts that we're using are concepts which are inside the dynamics that they focus on. In other words, when we talk about things like filter bubbles and fake news and post-truth, we're using ideas that are generated as part of the media dynamics that we're looking to analyze by those media dynamics themselves. And the questions that the conference asks about trying to discern what is new, what has intensified, what has changed, how does that look different from different positions within networks and national and regional contexts, I think this is very, very important. Because there's a way in which these concepts can become too technologically determinist, can become very ahistorical and asociological. So to say something about that briefly, in terms of my experience of talking about these things in class, for example, over the last year, in a class about media, news and journalism, one of the things we discussed is to what extent the idea of a filter bubble has always been part of the way in which people engage with media in terms of ideology, ideological commitment, and our identities in relation to media institutions and media as political forces. So those of you, for example, familiar with the histories of newspapers in Western Europe will know that newspapers developed through processes of what were called political parallelism. They had relationships to movements, they had relationships to political parties, and in Ireland, for example, people who bought the Irish Press would never buy the Irish Independent and vice versa, and this kind of dynamic is far more intense in France or Spain or Italy, for example. So what is it that we mean beyond the algorithmic when we talk about something like a filter bubble? Similarly, the question of fake news, I won't do a sort of, name and shame of major scandals among major international news brands in relation to plagiarism, fabrication, unverified sources and accusations. We need to be specific about what is the fakery that we're talking about, what is the kinds of fake content, and this is something Jane is going to talk about, that we have in mind when we use this neologism of fake news. And finally, and coming to our topic for today's Around the World event, the idea of post-truth. Well, those of you who have been following the French elections, for example, will be aware that what actually happened in French colonial history has been a major theme and recurring topic of debate between Emmanuel Macron and Marine Le Pen. Similarly, last year in Ireland was the centenary of the 1916 revolution or rebellion, where in public debate after public debate, it wasn't just that people's interpretations of events were different, but the actual facts and sources that were deemed to count were different as well. Yet we don't count this kind of debate as something which is shrouded in the dynamics of post-truth. So the question there again is, what makes the current era and what makes particular processes and dynamics count as post-truth, as opposed to the ideological and epistemological struggles which we know have always been part of public culture and public life. In the context of post-Brexit and post-Trump, or I suppose we're not quite post-Trump, are we? Post-Trump election, we're right in the middle of Trumpdom at the beginning. Derek Sayre, in a recent piece which I would highly recommend in the Journal of Historical Sociology, which is also free to download and free to read, does something which we would mainly always, of course, advise our students not to do. He uses Wikipedia and points out that Wikipedia actually have a very, very good definition or starting definition of what we might deem post-truth politics, or he prefers the idea of post-factual politics, which is a political culture, and I think the emphasis on culture rather than discrete actors is important, in which debate is largely framed by appeals to emotion, disconnected from the details of policy, although that could be taken, I think, too technocratically to assume that some policy-based governance is what he's advocating. I think that's not his argument. And the repeated assertion of talking points to which factual rebuttals are ignored. And these terms have been widely employed in the context of the EU referendum and the 2016 presidential election, which is where we are. Now, the reason that I wanted to, in the context of the intensification of thinking about these terms in this context, the reason I wanted to focus on the far right, and I do it sometimes reluctantly because there's a tendency to exceptionalize the far right politically, to look at it as a kind of pathology which is solely responsible, for example, for racism in our societies. Whereas in fact, if we look sociologically and politically at racism, the far right is but one of the actors which are important in fleshing out that picture. But I think one of the things we can tell from looking at the ways in which the far right have benefited from the digital media post-truth conjuncture is that it can also help us look more structurally and systematically at the ways in which what we're calling the post-truth era actually works and the way in which media works. Before we get to that briefly, to say something about what I mean about the far right. Apologies, again, global apologies for the text-heavy presentation, but I wanted in a short talk to if you like, to put up some exclamation marks around some of these terms. The idea of the far right, I think, is quite a complex one. Emmanuel Gavan talks about the far right as a heteroclete family. And this is interesting because families, as we know, are all unhappy in their ways. And at the moment, there's a tendency to see the far right as something which is uniformly on the rise across something called the West. And this isn't true either electorally or socially or politically. And the reason he emphasizes the idea of a family is that there are lots of different kinds of relationships between parties and movements within nations and across nations. And what counts and who counts as far right within that picture is often very complex. So that's just to put some parenthesis around that for a moment. But one of the reasons why the far right is interesting to look at in terms of digital media is because, on the one hand, the far right is characterized, as we know, by doctrinal difference, by ideological fracture, by very deeply held and often irreconcilable positions. On the other hand, it's characterized by fluidity and by ideological promiscuity and by sharing between contexts. And this is something which is hugely intensified in a digital media context. The capacity to share and to exchange and to adapt across borders in a transnational media environment is something that the far right have adopted to, in many ways, very, very successfully. Successfully at the level of text, successfully at the level of ideology, not necessarily successful at the level of mobilizing a social movements in particular contexts. And that's something, again, that I want to emphasize. There's an awful lot of activity online and activity on digital media that doesn't translate into actual boots on the street or movements which are mobilizing in given societies. Here, for example, in the last year, we've had successful attempts to try to generate online presences for Pegida Ireland, for example, borrowing from the movement which began in 2014 in Dresden, or from the Soldiers of Odin, a movement which gathered some steam in Finland from 2015 onwards. And interestingly, there's been attempts to use digital media to transplant these movements almost as franchises into different social contexts, more or less often without any great success. So again, just differentiating between social mobilization and the kinds of online presence that we see. But to try to reach a couple of points and then pass the floor on to the other speakers here, if we want to try to see why, or just try to be a little bit more specific about post-truth dynamics and the ways in which they benefit the far right, but also how analysing the far right can tell us something about those dynamics, I want to talk a little bit about what I think is one of the, and I should apologise for the distressing image before putting it up there, but I want to talk a little bit about a book by Mark Andreevich called Infoglut, which was published in 2013, and I think in many ways is one of the best guides to what we're now calling post-truth, but he doesn't use these terms in the book, which is possibly why it's been sort of passed over in some of these discussions. And what Andreevich does is takes issue with the idea that what we are facing as consumers or as citizens or as media users in terms of a kind of a glut of pushed mediated information is that the main question is how to filter, how to manage this kind of information glut. The main consequence, he argues, the most profound consequence of infoglut is a kind of a haunting. And that haunting is an awareness that everything is contingent, everything is partial. We can, particularly when it comes to unfolding events, we can never be fully informed. There's a constant multiplication of available accounts of reality. There's constantly moving evidential basis and so forth. So what happens, he argues, or what has happened under digital media conditions, is our historical assumptions about the relationship of power and information have been inverted. If we look at the history of mass media institutions in the 20th century in particular, we see that the struggles, of course, have been about information scarcity. They've been struggles over censorship, they've been struggles over ownership, they've been struggles over information or media as a public good. Struggles, if you like, over the relationship between the few to the many. But a consequence, he argues, of information glut is that we are left with modes of critique and ways of thinking about information and power which we've inherited from the long 20th century, but which don't make as much sense in thinking about the conditions under which we now organise or seek to know. Which is, and the point that he makes, is that forms of critique, forms of skepticism, forms of kind of hermeneutic suspicion, which were developed under a context of scarcity. In other words, this person who says they're telling me the truth, how do I know they're actually telling me the truth when they have, if you like, control over the means of communication? That these forms of critique no longer serve exclusively critical or progressive ends. In other words, the idea that truth is simply a construct is now something which is not just amplified by the internet, but something which is amplified tactically by the right wing. So what he does is argues that what he calls the postmodern right, and here he's mainly writing, for example, about climate change, he's writing, yes, about electoral politics in the United States, but what he argues is that in an expanded media space, where any available narrative, where any available account of reality is simply engulfed by other accounts and becomes indeterminate, the political challenge and political power is not necessarily in mounting a counter-narrative, but it is in narrative multiplication. It's in emphasizing the way that everything is contingent, everything is, if you like, partial. And what he argues is this is done in two major ways. One is the constant drive to debunk, and the other is, of course, information proliferation. And I'll give one example of that, which is the distressing image that you see here of Alan Kurdi's body on a beach near Bodrum from September 2015, which was a hugely widely circulated photo, the most widely circulated photo, I think, on Twitter at that moment in time. It's a very interesting research project for those interested in Sheffield University, for example, on the life of this photograph. But as this photo circulated, what you got as well was these kinds of annotated photos, which began on right-wing websites, made their way through Breitbart to be circulated more widely. Where what you can see what they're doing here is using the tools of critique and hermeneutic suspicion to say, if this body actually washed up on a beach like this, there's no way that it would be able to lie this way, there's no way it would look this way after being exposed to the elements for this length of time, and so on. In other words, the point that Andreevich makes is that critique, suspicion of the image, has now become, if you like, a constant reactionary reflex. Therefore, it's not possible for this photo to rest as a truth claim. It becomes constantly undermined. It becomes constantly indeterminate. So we can see that, if you like, if we can see the ways in which these, what are essentially postmodern techniques, have become very, very important to the far right, which we don't normally associate with postmodernism, in narrative multiplication and in bringing in these kinds of uncertainty as to truth claims about our societies. These are not new. For example, the slide on the left there, many of you will be familiar with the idea of masked sites, which is something which has been researched at length in the 1990s, using websites to draw people into false sites where, in this instance, your high school student wants to do a project on Martin Luther King, and they click on this website, and once they click on a couple of links, they find themselves deep in anti-Semitic conspiracy theory. But the difference that networked media makes, of course, is that what Adam Klein calls information laundering is much more prevalent, which is we can't tell what the original source for something is. It allows people to circulate statistics about migration, the truth, various kinds of truth claims or knowledge signifying claims about migrants or minorities or whatever it might be. So the point I'm trying to make then, I think, is that if we look at the kind of work that I think Andreevich has done on this idea of radical indeterminacy being the basis for thinking about this post-truth or post-factual environment, we can go a long way, I think, towards unpacking some of the dynamics at play, but also maybe possibly some of the responses to it. On the rest of the slides that you can see there, I go through some of the ways in which these have actually become the basis for political tactics. Political tactics which are based increasingly, and you can see this at the moment in many European countries, on simply saying the mainstream media is part of the problem, they're part of the corrupt elite, and therefore we're creating our own alternative media spaces, which then become part of the mainstream because of the ways in which they're integrated into the news cycle by journalists and so forth. But I think that's enough for me, from me for now, and goodbye world, or whatever it's for me to say.
Thank you very much, Gavin. That was very interesting. I'm looking forward to the roundtable later when we get the chance to discuss more of this information, particularly how to filter this info flood as you described. Our next speaker now is Dr. Jane Suter. Jane Suter is of the Institute for Future Media and Journalism. FUJO? Is that
FUJO, yeah.
FUJO, good, at Dublin City University. Jane will be speaking about elements about how to tackle fake news.
Okay, that's great. Thanks very much. Hello world, whoever's out there and up and about. So delighted to be here. So I just want to say just a really quick sentence about FUJO, because what I'm going to try to do is kind of present little bits of different projects that lots of people in our centre are working on. So we're a multidisciplinary research centre in Dublin City University, and we have data scientists and engineers, as well as journalism and sociologists, political scientists, ethicists, and so on. So tried to look at this kind of in a broad way. But when we thought about it, we thought like one of the easiest ways to kind of look at the problem is to go back to, you know, the very basic kind of standard triangle of media production. And we look at it and we see on the one hand we have production. So how are things produced? Then we have the content. It used to be the text, but in this new world we're calling it content because it's now video and so on as well. And then of course the audience, so how the audience reacts with that. And again, things are obviously much more mixed up now than they were originally, so the audience can now be producers and they're creating content and so on. But still, I think the basic triangle can help us get to grips with what's going on. So the first question we would look at then is production. So how and why is fake news produced? So on the one hand, we have people like the infamous Macedonian teenagers who are making up fake news in order to accrue ad dollars and to make themselves wealthy. They've got no other motivation. But then we also have the kind of people that Gavin was talking about on the far right and indeed in other places, who actually have partisan reasons for making up fake news about Hillary Clinton in pizza parlors in Washington, or this kind of nonsense, or climate deniers. Then when we look at the content, so we have to think, well, what form and style does it take? So we saw very briefly at the end of Gavin's presentation there, where you can see that sometimes it's content that has very high production values. There are logos that would make people think, oh yeah, this is definitely a kind of a legitimate organisation. Some of the climate deniers do this really well. They actually have fake conferences and so on, and pretend experts that, you know, are supposedly arguing both sides to lull people into to ease. But on the other hand, some content is done with shaky camera work and red text and this kind of thing, because that's the kind of content that appeals to the audience that news is being targeted at. So then we look at the audiences and we say, well, why should people believe it? Why are people doing it? So on the one hand, audiences can be targeted much more easily now than they could be targeted beforehand under mass propaganda models, because the algorithms allow, you know, very detailed, personalised targeting of people on Facebook especially. But also in this kind of environment where there's declining trust in all sorts of institutions, and often for very good reasons. So there's declining trust across the world in political parties, in politicians, in the church, in media, in tabloid journalism. So in that kind of an environment, as Gavan said as well, there's good reason to distrust, there's good reason to be sceptical, but then on the other hand, that can be played on and people can be brought down a kind of a rabbit hole. So then we thought, well, okay, how is the world addressing this? It's come on, the reason we're talking about it today, it's come on post the Trump campaign and first 100 days and so on. So what's happening? So if we look at it from the production point of view, then we have sort of efforts from Google and Facebook especially, where they're trying to, or allegedly trying to restrict the distribution avenues. So some of the more obviously fake news, Holocaust denial, for example, mightn't be quite so high up on the Google search algorithm as it was 2 months ago. Or the kind of the fact that brands have reacted to having their advertising placed next to hate or to fake news. There are efforts to try to undo this and to address it. So that's kind of where a lot of the effort is in terms of the production. Then if we think about it in terms of the content, then a lot of the effort here is going into sort of fact checking and that kind of thing. So we're part of an organisation called First Draft in the US, and they have a great campaign at the moment in France ahead of the French elections, where they're attempting with sort of NewsWhip technology to spot the stories that are beginning to move fast on social, and then they have teams of journalists who are going in and fact-checking this. So instead of every news organisation having their own fact-checker, they do this collectively, and then the news organisations put this out collectively. AFP put it out. They're just starting this week for the British general election, again trying to check some of the claims that we saw on the kind of fake news that we saw proliferating in the Brexit referendum. And then in terms of audiences, I think there's been a lot less industry focus on this, so perhaps more academic focus on the audiences, and I think this is where we probably need to have more effort. But here there's kind of studies of trust. So why is it? What are the kind of the enablers for people, for them to think about why they should or shouldn't trust different kinds of content? What are the kind of consumption patterns that do it? You know, we have one of my colleagues, Eugenia Ciapera, is doing a really interesting study at the moment in terms of looking at media diaries, and then we have another which is experiments where we're showing people different kinds of fake news and trying to understand what are the kind of heuristics or shortcuts that they're taking in terms of trying to do that. And then, of course, there's always the focus on digital media literacy. So, you know, from primary school children right the way through to third level students. But the other thing we'd like to argue, and I think Gavan was kind of coming at this as well, is that we need to go beyond just what is fake and understand, well, what is the type of trustworthy news, trustworthy content that, you know, should be supported by people who believe in democracies. So on the one hand, we have kind of production. There's huge issues with business models, Facebook and Google taking 80% of global advertising revenues. Hugely problematic for all sorts of things. So we have models like the new kind of Wikimedia kind of things that are going on. But this is relying on the crowd, and we know that the crowd can go one way or the other. It's great when the crowd is in your way, but it's not so great if a crowd is manipulated in another way. In terms of the content, how can trustworthy news distinguish itself? So again, we have this thing where we have photos that are now contested, so you can draw doubts on it. For Trump, fake news is the New York Times. So, what way can content be done? And then in terms of the audience, for new forms, they need heuristics. We've got this information overload, so we need to be thinking of ways that audiences can have shortcuts, can have heuristics, in order to understand what it is that's trustworthy. So this is our final slide, and it's just a very brief idea of some of the research projects that we're working on here. So some of them are around transparency tools, and transparency marks around content, so people can understand what it is that the content is actually based on, and then can go in behind it. There's stuff around trust, what enables trust. I spoke a little bit about a couple of those before. And then other projects in terms of enabling digital literacy. So hopefully I kept within my 7 minutes there, and delighted to pass on to whoever is next. Thank you very much.
Yeah, good morning to our colleagues in Alberta, and it's a pleasure to be here today. I'm speaking very much as a practicing lawyer, not as an academic. What follows is my own subjective reflections on post-truth, or what I prefer to call the fake news era we've entered. I work exclusively in the area of media and entertainment law, which obviously includes a lot of news and current affairs work over the past 20 years. And really that's the basis on which I make my observations. And I would like to take the opportunity in the next 7 minutes, and Neale, please wave if I'm going over time, to look in very broad terms at the issue of the status of modern social media platforms as publishers or not, as the case may be in Ireland, the UK, the EU and the US. I remember about 15 years ago, way before Facebook had 1.9 billion users, an older radio producer I worked with coming to me with a mixture of both disbelief and amusement, following a conversation he just had with a young station manager. And she said to him, your generation is so hung up on facts. And that was stunned him at the time. And the sensationalism of non-factual news has been coming down the tracks at us, I think, for years. Social media has facilitated and fed the monster, let's say, and now it's arguably out of control. And it's only now, I think, that we're really noticing as we recognise it and see its effects in political and economic terms and on a global scale. I have a concern about the term post-truth era. There's a normalisation of the post-truth era in saying this, as if we've got to all accept we live in the post-truth era. I'm not sitting back and accepting that, and I believe we live in an era of fake news, and I want to call it and address it as such. I'm interested in what Gavan introduces to, the idea there of Derek Sayers' post-factual politics, which I think encapsulates much more accurately what we're talking about. And that's no criticism of whoever selected the title, just teasing it out and challenging it. And in order to address this fake news phenomenon, we do need to analyse and understand the dynamics of it, and this is what today's discussion is all about. As I said, I'm not an academic, I'm a practicing lawyer. The ideas I express are based on personal observation and reflection, and not research or empirical data, so just so you know that. Fake news has been with us for thousands of years. For Abrahamic religious traditions, it's been encapsulated since biblical times in the commandment, thou shalt not bear false witness. I mean, right back then, thousands of years ago, it was recognised that false information harms society. Another old maxim, the truth is the first casualty of war. When extreme propaganda will tell a nation or an army that it's winning when it's losing, when the opposite may be the case, but morale must be sustained. This goes the argument. So lies and half-truths are promulgated by state authorities, supposedly in the national interest. And we've always had fake news. I'm not endorsing it, I'm not saying it's right, but it has always been a concept that affects us as a society. But what's happened, in my view, with three factors that I feel have given rise to the phenomenon of fake news and social media, to the extent that it's now significantly influencing not only the internal politics of nation states, but also global politics and economics. First, I think, is the global reach of social media. Second is, I think, the linguistic reach of English language, and Gavin, you referred there to the preeminence at this point in time of Anglophone publications. And third is the use of algorithms to present material to the online reader based on previously indicated preferences by that reader, what's been called the echo chamber effect. I was hearing anecdotally the other day of somebody who tried to open his mind by going on to sites deliberately that he didn't agree with. But what was clear was that the algorithms were working on his likes on Facebook and kept shoving him back into the echo chamber of his previously expressed preferences, even though he was trying, in terms of hits, of trying to look at websites that would present him with challenges to his own view. So let's look at the whole question of global reach. Take Facebook. Monthly active users, and those are users who actually access Facebook in the last 30 days, are estimated to be roughly 1.9 billion. As of this morning, the world population was reckoned to be 7.5 billion and rising. Now, where do I get that? I get it from something called worldometers. I've had to make an evaluation as to whether or not they're reliable. So I looked at About Us, I looked at their critiques of them. So I needed to make an educated guess they're reliable. That's all. I never heard of worldometers before I looked up what's the world's population today. So anyway, we have about 25% of the entire population of the world accessing a single social media platform. You and I, Jane, were having a conversation about this earlier, and you may have comments to make about that, particularly its effect in Africa. Let's focus on Facebook for now, because that's just what Mark Zuckerberg wants us to do. We've then got the next question of English language reach. I'm not saying that fake news occurs in English only, as we've seen in respect of the French presidential election. But today, 25% of the world's population speaks some English, between 1.5 and 1.75 billion people. It's another site I thought was reasonably reputable, the British Council site. Another council that is a site that looks reasonably reputable, but that's the best I can do about it, is Statista.com. That says 350 million people speak it as a first language. And that's, once again, approximately 25% of the world population speaking English. So there's a lot of this fake news is coming out in Anglophone, in an Anglophone context. And finally, I do have a link on my presentation, which I make available later, something called Mashable.com. It's very interesting information about how to avoid, how to modify the way you'll be targeted by algorithms. But frankly, I don't have time or can't be bothered to make the time. And that is the problem. It's convenient. We all want our news in bite-sized pieces that we can read in the bus. Some of the older Irish people here will remember the Irish Times. Well, the Irish Times is still in existence. It's our paper of record. And there was a famous ad many years ago that said, if you miss the Irish Times, you miss part of the day. To which the wags would respond with some justification, and if you read the Irish Times, you miss the whole day. We are looking, and I buy the Irish Times myself. I think it's a fantastic newspaper, fantastic institution. But the reality is we all want our information in bite-sized pieces. And this social media monster is feeding that. Algorithms are feeding it. And you actually have to go outside the norm. You have to make such an effort to go outside. I'm concerned. How much time do I have left, Neale?
About 20 seconds.
Oh, darn. Okay, well then I'm going to have a very quick, what I'm going to say is I will put my paper up online. And talk about, which talks about looking at the US and Ireland and the UK and Europe. The law in all of those jurisdictions has effectively found and established, both in court cases and legislation, that social media platforms are not publishers. The difference between US law and European law, including Ireland and England for the time, or UK for the time being anyway as regards UK, is that once there's a notice and takedown protocol in effect, if online social media platforms want to avoid liability, particularly in the area of defamation, which is not the case in the US, a very high level of protection for breach of intellectual property rights. But I have set that out in more detail. We do have a very strong regulatory regime in this jurisdiction. And for broadcast outlets, we have a voluntary regulatory regime for our print media outlets. We have no regulatory regime for online news and news service outlets. There is, in fairness to one outlet called the journal.ie. It is voluntarily subscribed to what we call the Press Council. I give a link to it here in my talk. But whether it enhances, it certainly enhances the credibility of journal.ie, but whether it enhances the profitability of online news sources in Ireland is a question that merits further exploration. I thought actually my talk was going to be much shorter than anybody else's. There's one more idea I'd like to offer you. In an ideal world, Facebook and Twitter, I think, would offer a banner that would pop up before you hit send, and with little queries such as, will this post add to the sum of human knowledge? Is your post for the benefit of society? Are you satisfied what you're posting is true? With an additional banner, honestly? Your friends love hearing your opinions. Are you sure your opinions are based on facts? Please confirm you've reflected for 30 seconds on your post before hitting post. But that might discourage posts and, God forbid, decrease advertising revenue. So what price reflective, informed, fact-based social and political discourse? That's what I would provide. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Andrea. I can see that you've sort of set Twitter alight with that, so we'll have some interesting comments from Twitter after that. Our next speaker is Mr. Peter McGuire, who's a news and features journalist for the Irish Times and the Huffington Post. And he's going to be speaking on obstacles to developing critical thinking.
Okay, yeah, I'll try and fly through this and just cut me off if I'm going too long. I want to leave space, of course, for the round table. Recently, the president of the Secondary Teachers Union stood up at the lectern at their conference and accused the media of lashing out fake news, and both myself and the education editor of the Irish Times challenged him on that. And he went, in general, and he didn't actually follow through and explain why. So I think fake news has become this term that allows people just to dismiss a journalist, to dismiss information without actually having to say, well, here's why you're wrong. And obviously we've seen that with Trump. It's always good. Of course, the media should be contested and challenged, but if you're going to do that, you need to actually do it properly and present your evidence. I think one of the big problems is that, particularly I'm going to talk a little bit about the Irish context, that journalists here are expected, particularly on broadcast because of our broadcast regulations, to be neutral, which means that they take each side, each viewpoint as equal in value, irrespective of what they're saying. Whereas really journalists should be objective. They should be looking at the facts. They should be reporting on that, whether it's unfavourable to the group that they like or not. One of the most important, I think, people in this conversation is Jay Rosen, the professor of journalism at NYU. And he says that journalists need to ditch this pretense, really, that we're completely neutral and the world's going to be neutral. And we need to say, look, here's where we're coming from. Here's our evidence. Here's the documents. Here's who we've spoken to. We've dug up the information. And they need to show their work, really, show the data. I think for me as a journalist, a lot of what I've been doing in recent years is much more of the long read kind of stuff. I enjoy doing that, but I also think it allows that information to be teased out in a way that isn't necessarily possible in a bite-sized or a very short news piece. And readers are actually responding to that. Certainly the Irish Times metrics indicate that they are. Not all of them, obviously, but there is stories out there that are doing well. The Journal does good long reads as well, and longreads.com is good for looking at that too. And it allows a multiplicity of viewpoints and perspectives. Going back to the Irish broadcast media, which I'd be quite critical of, particularly the RTE, on my way down here this morning I heard another debate about Catholicism on the radio, and yet again it was a hardline conservative Opus Dei member versus a member of Atheists Ireland. And recently myself and one of my editors, Roisin Ingle, got quite frustrated with this narrative, and we decided we would do something a bit longer on Catholicism. And I spoke to some of the hardliners, and I spoke to some of the pro-choice Catholics, and I spoke to people who are kind of culturally Catholic, and there's much more perspectives than you will hear certainly on Irish media, or Irish radio or Irish TV. The same happens with debates on abortion. There's so many shades there, and it's always the two extremes versus each other. And I think public service broadcasting in Ireland does the people of Ireland a massive disservice by not allowing more space for the grey areas. So yeah, this stuff is difficult to. Fake news is quite difficult to challenge, because we all know that people have their confirmation biases, and we all know about the backfire effect, where people just get more and more entrenched in their views the more you challenge them. I experienced this personally with an article I wrote on fluoride, which more so than any other article I've written just got a huge heap of personal abuse, more so than any articles on abortion or any of the things you would think would be contentious. So when we talk about, there's a lot of talk here about the far right, but we also have to remember that there's a little bit of a slightly, I don't know how to phrase it properly, but slightly hippie, far left kind of anti-science angle as well. That's also growing on the internet as well, and you wouldn't necessarily associate it with the far right, but it doesn't necessarily have truth. So there's other pressures on newsrooms as well. We all know about those pressures on newsrooms at the moment: lack of advertising, readership declining, PR filling in for where news should be. And I think really where this can be addressed is the education system, and Dr. Jane Souter referred to that early on in her speech with digital media literacy, and we need to move towards a lot more of that, because there's no point, there's all these things that need to be taught in the education system: sex education, ICT, languages, but unless you can teach children how to think, how to critically think, how to analyse information, how to go, okay, look, we've seen this article here, let's look at this source, where's that source, is that source valid? If you can teach kids that's the fundamentals of thinking, that's the fundamentals of learning, and they'll be able to continue to learn throughout their life and to look at media critically. And look, you can teach it in schools, and schools might be seen as another part of the authority system, but you can teach kids how to think for themselves and how to look at the information. We're moving slightly towards that in Ireland. It's happening slowly. There's a lot of opposition to some of those reforms that need to take place, particularly in the second level system, but these are the vital skills I think that we need to improve. I'll stop there, but yeah, thanks.
Thank you very much. That was really, really interesting. Okay, in the interest of time, I realise time is slipping away on us. I think it's time to turn over to a bit of a roundtable discussion. Before we do, I just want to remind anybody watching that you can get involved if you just tweet us with the hashtag ATW2017. And with that, I'd like to pass over to my co-chairs, Mr. John Chambers and Professor Susan Schreibman, to open up proceedings.
Well, thank you all. Those were fabulous, and there was lots of resonances between them. I wanted to pick up maybe on something that maybe Gavin started with, and I think Jane and Andrea both commented on the kind of the terms that we're using, kind of fake news, post-truth. You all brought up is, I mean, obviously there wasn't fake. I don't want to use the word fake news. there wasn't information. Everything wasn't correct before 2016. We had other words that we called it. Maybe lies, maybe misinformation, depending on the regime. So what's different? You kind of hinted at it in some of the talks, but there seems to be something noticeably different. Is it just we have a term for it? Is there more of it? Is it because of social media? Or is it not different? We just think it is because it's our present moment.
I mean, I think this really is the question, and I think this is why the work of today is to try to work towards that question. I mean, it's 10 days ago was the 80th anniversary of the bombing of Guernica, and to mark it, a chapter of Peter Preston's book, The Spanish Holocaust, was released as a small extract where he was looking simply at the reporting of the aftermath of Guernica. And I've forgotten the name of the London Times journalist, but a journalist who was able to get there very quickly afterwards and wrote relentlessly about what happened. And his report was carried by the London Times 2 days afterwards, and there was an extraordinary effort by both the sort of Spanish fascist high command and the German high command, not just to say that this is propaganda, but to actually use techniques that we would now associate with the discussions that we have about fake news. That actually, first of all, nothing happened, but then the Republicans actually carried out this bombing as a false flag You know, they use the same kind of language. So I think we have to bear all of that in mind. If I was to try to give a short answer to what's different, I think the question of the use of this notion that Adam Klein has of information laundering, that people can quite deliberately introduce forms of information, fact claims, digital artifacts which make fact claims, which enter into circulation and become true or truthy by dint of their circulation. It's the circulation that gives them power. And that this happens in contexts where there are lots of political actors that have the motivated capacity to do this, but also that these factual or post-factual artifacts circulate through networks where we have forms of what's often called in relation to social media context collapse, that they move from place to place, they get cut and paste from place to place as sort of as sound bites, as just sort of digital bites, which people can choose to engage with or not. So we're not most of the time when we think about truth and critical claims in public, we actually have a model in our minds of public discussion as like a seminar room where claims get sort of tested against each other under conditions which allow the best argument to win. Of course, mediated life has never been like that, but it's much less like that now if we look at the proliferation of spaces and the ways in which truth claims move through them. So I would say the combination of more possibilities for deliberate forms of fakery and misinformation, but combined with the ways in which we, with the things we've discussed, the ways in which we access public discourse.
Yeah, no, I think that's fairly. Just last night, I went to see a film called The Promise, which is about the Armenian genocide, which Turkey still denies ever took place. So obviously we've always had this, but I think it's exactly as Gavan said. It's the speed with which we can do this. It's the kind of globalized chambers and discourses and groups. It's the fact that the information is so available and that it stays, that we can't get rid of it because of the digital archiving. It's the kind of availability that like I have a teenage daughter. I have no when she goes on YouTube, the kind of evidence that the various YouTubers are presenting to her, I have much less access and control over that than my mother did when I was 15 in terms of the information that I could access. So I think it's this accelerated way of being able to do it, and it's the kind of all the affordances of digital, which on the one hand can be so enabling, they can also be enabling of other kinds of material that is very damaging to our democracies, which I actually think is, so important. What Andrea said about this needs to be regulated in some form because of this, because of these affordances.
My view would be that it's been coming at us for a long time. There were two facts, certainly in the Western world, two events that focused us. It was like car crash news, watching both the Brexit campaign and the outcome and the US election. And I think for what might be broadly called the establishment, the media completely underestimated the willingness of voters to allow themselves to be swayed by facts that were clearly exaggerated, wrong, inaccurate, manipulated. And I think the astonishing thing is, there were those moments that you'll never forget, and that moment I'll never forget is watching Farage pretty much acknowledge defeat on the night of the Brexit vote and waking up at 3:30 in the morning and realising it's passed, much to the surprise of even those who were campaigning for it. And pretty much the same thing happened with Trump. The night went through and you woke up and he was and he was president. Those two factors have taken us all and woken us up and raised big questions about who among us is being swayed in this way, and there are millions out there, and how is it happening?
And I think that what goes with what you're saying is, if we could put it this way, who's responsible, or who's in part responsible. Obviously people vote, but I think then the media has probably a lot to answer for, and certainly, to allow my accent, I followed the American elections even closer and even voted, but after there was a lot of soul searching by mainstream media about what have we enabled, how have we covered this, we give the same space, but should we be giving the same space?
Yeah,
Yeah.
sorry
Yeah,
to
no, no,
interrupt.
no.
Sorry, but yeah, just briefly to say, I do think just one I didn't get to say in my speech was that that approach of this point of view and that point of view, it's so divisive, and the media is doing it all the time, and it's not creating space for a plurality of voices. It's too binary, and it divides people, and that's not what they should be doing. And I think that would be, it's not the step, it's a step I think that needs to be taken. Just be a bit less divisive and be aware that not everything is black and white. There's lots of great publications doing that, by the way, and lots of great outlets doing it, but there's not enough, and we probably need a bit more of that. And we need to learn how to listen to each other as well, and not this debate, everything's a debate. Why can't there be more discussion? Sorry.
Actually, we have a follow-up discussion for you, Peter, from Twitter here, which comes from Chelsea Mia, who wants to know, is this the best or worst time to be a journalist? And how has reporting changed in the post-truth era?
I don't think it's changed very much, actually. Not. I'd say Jane and Gavin might even know more than I would. I don't think it has changed much. I think it's responding, but this takes time for it to respond. I guess every journalist is aware of it, and I think most decent journalists are looking to build models. There's a good model that in the Netherlands called The Conversation. I don't know if you guys have heard of that. It's a subscription-only model, no advertising. Different models are being tried, and that might open up space for more detailed reporting, more investigative reporting. Best time or worst time? Both. It's challenging, interesting. It's certainly dynamic. I think it's a terrible time to start off as a journalist. I would never be starting off as a journalist now, but I'm luckily fairly well established at this point in my career. But starting off, God no. Oh.
Yeah, I was going to say that I think it's that there's a lot of people saying, oh, it's media and media soul searching, and I saw Nate Silver yesterday put out something saying that actually the way the New York Times and other outlets covered James Comey in the last week of the American election, that might have actually made a point or two difference in key swing states that might have actually enabled the electoral college result that we saw. So I think that's all true, but I think the elephant in the room is social media, because a plurality of people are getting their news from social media, not from even the media, from any one outlet. So, and I think it's the affordance of social media to allow people and to allow organisations like Cambridge Analytics to go in and target people and to target the worst kind of emotions of people. And I think that's actually what the issue is, and that we need to be able to look at that and to understand how we actually cope with this kind of targeting of people's emotions through social.
Kind of building on that a little bit, I'm curious, when it comes to, there are quite a few people who mentioned the audience and kind of a lack of trust in the content that's being put forward, even when it's factual information. And Peter, you discussed the backfire effect, which is kind of contributing to this kind of echo chamber mentality. And I'm wondering, is social media kind of just taking that and magnifying it and making it worse? And how do we increase the trust with the audience when the media is putting forth actual factual information? It's not fake news or post-truth, but where so many people question it because of the backfire effect.
I'll just say 3 words: show your work.
Yeah, transparency. Like that's who was it? The guys who were doing the Wiki Tribune were saying, transparency is the kryptonite of kind of fake news. So, but the problem is people's short attention span, and how much are they going to go look at it? But if somehow you can make that transparency visible, so people can use it as a heuristic and to understand, then I think that works.
I mean, I think this is really interesting, because what you're doing as well as suggesting that we need also to do 2 things simultaneously. One is isolate what is it about the sort of network dynamics of social media, connected media, and at the same time we need to layer it in conjuncturally and say what are the things that are going on in politics, society, and the economy around this, which make we certainly don't need to bring back discredited models of dumb audiences, who are kind of captive and ideologically susceptible. But what is it which drives various levels of kind of a crisis of authority or of expertise? If we were sitting here 15 years ago, we'd be talking about the crisis of we'd be talking about the crisis of expertise and sort of late modernity and the risk society, those kinds of things. And if we look at what's happened since then, we certainly have come to a moment, if we look at the Trump election and the Brexit election, where people have lived through several generations of a decreased relationship between their representative democratic decisions and its impact over their lives, right? So in other words, there's a gap has opened up between the mechanisms and the rituals and the performance of representative politics and the idea that me being informed and voting on the basis of that information actually has some kind of material or political impact in my life. That's something which, you know, is kind of well documented in the political science. We've lived through the global economic crisis, where the single greatest purveyor of fake news is the discipline of economics and the fetishization of, in public, by the media, of economists as people who are telling us factually how our lives are going to be directed by certain sorts of empirical models and forecasting models and so forth, all of whom missed this enormous and deeply politically unsettling economic crisis over the last years. So in some ways, if we look at these as kind of tectonic shifts, it's no accident that when you layer social media and its horizontal mechanisms and the kind of the point Jane makes about speed, I think, is absolutely crucial here, into this kind of context, well then it certainly deeply exacerbates these discussions about expertise or authority in society and how we imagine their reconstruction, and I've no answer to that.
I'm afraid we're going to have to leave it there, unfortunately. We've reached the end of our session. As you can see, it's a massive, massive topic, and we could sit here and talk about it for far longer. But some of the items that you've raised here and the issues that you've raised are very fascinating, and hopefully we can continue this conversation throughout the day with the rest of the conference. Susan, John, do you have any last comments?
Yeah, I'm just going to thank everybody. You know, our speakers, everybody else in the room. Jeffrey, thank you for putting this on. And I think, where do you go next? France?
I think it's going to France next.
Okay.
So thank you all very much.
Yes,
Very
thank you.
much.
Thank you.
Thank you all very much.